One thing I always tell my clients is like, I'm not really in the watch business. I'm in the relationship business. I love watches. I have a passion of watches that is insane, but I'm really more about the connection. I'm more about the customer and making sure at the end of the day, you're happy. You're, you know, I think a great example with me and Geoff here is a couple of these pieces you didn't get from me, but we consulted, we talked. That's what these independent watchmakers seem to treasure and see the value, 100%. You know, and know what's going on. It's all about the client at the end of the day.
The better boutiques try to capture that experience, but your relationship is with the sales personnel. And because in a big brand, the watchmakers are a sea of people. I'm sure there are great watchmakers in there, but they're subverted to the brand. But here, you know, the watchmakers front.
What got you into watches? What sparked it all?
Well, my my grandfather gave me two watches. One was a Longines rectangular case from the 1940s, and then when my father graduated law school in the end of the late 1950s, he bought two Omegas, one for my father, one for himself, and I subsequently inherited both of those watches. So that's what got me interested in watches. Unfortunately, those watches, our house was burgled, and we lost all those watches. And for many years, it kind of lost interest. Yeah. And probably around 2009, 2010, I ran across some new old stock in a jewelry store. There was, at that time, was a representative for Glashütte Original Geo, and they were no longer going to be representative. And I saw the chronometer, that Senator chronometer, which is this fantastic watch. And I started doing some research on it and realized, you know, in that period of time, that 20 years since I really thought seriously about watches, how much information was now available to a hobbyist as opposed to an expert. And so I think I bought that watch and fell in love with it, but it also was kind of a gateway into thinking more deeply about watches. I think in terms of looking at independence, again, being a hobbyist is, and not being your primary job, it's much easier, I think. You know, I think of watches in the context of their technology and where they sit, let's say, in the history of science, and what is, you know, they're kind of totems, right? They look backwards. They're related to themselves within their brands, within their families. And I'm always interested in the stories of watches and how their technology relates to some of the founders, and how, I think in this era in particular, with advances in material science and advanced manufacturing, how a lot of ideas that were theoretical, couldn't be accomplished, are now possible. And these are generally, in many cases, bespoke watches, and instead of you as a customer having a relationship with the brand, you often end up a relationship with the watchmaker. So it's a very different, you know, interaction. When you deal with Grönefeld or with, I mean, Kari Voutilainen, it's by email, it's by phone if you want to, but I did mostly by email or text. And he'll come back, he'll say that's a good idea or bad idea, so you feel like you're engaged or involved, you know, in the process, and they're extremely supportive. Like, if anything goes wrong with the watch, you send it back to them. Not only, and I shared some of the text with CQ, is this watch had to be repaired, and he'll send you back and he'll tell you what was wrong with it and explain it to you, you know, in your watchmakers for idiots type of way.
Yeah,
it's a touch. Like when you sent me that text, I was like, this can't be real, you know, because that touch is just not, you know, there's certain brands out there you could spend $1 million and you can't get somebody on the phone, you know, and you gotta.
It was interesting. I got this watch this summer, and Kari Voutilainen was in the U.S. to attend some conference, and he actually delivered the watch to
that's amazing. I mean,
insane.
I mean, the downside is it's a very small community of watches. So if you're a collector and you're thinking about resale, you know, every so often there's a Dufour out there, and those are very special. But you know, the market, the 40 people who are probably interested in the watch probably own it.
Right.
And one doesn't know what happens 20 or 30 years from now. So that you don't have the same kind of liquidity or pricing transparency.
The thing that jumps out to me is the technology. The narrative of telling time is different on each watch, and that is fascinating. I mean, you could essentially have a bunch of different kinds of watches that tell time in different ways, and a lot of brands do that. But there is something engaging about looking at a particular watch And we can obviously start with the H.Moser here and discuss that piece, which we are familiar with. CQ and I are familiar with as we sell. We get the watches in from time to time. It is a small, again, micro-independent brand, but this is a special watch, and this is the H.Moser One perpetual calendar. So tell us a little bit about what you like about the watch and sort of your sensibilities.
Well, the backstory is, and you mentioned earlier about consulting, is there are a couple of these great watchmakers. One of the most famous is Andreas Strehler, and he has his own atelier. I think he makes his 10 watches a year, but he also does a lot of consulting work and finishing work and design work for other watchmakers and other brands. And what's interesting about him is that as he grew through his career before he became independent, he ended up at a very famous technology shop in the watch world, Renault Pepe, which is now owned by AP, and he was there at the same time as Greubel Forsey, the Grönefeld brothers, which is a pretty amazing.
Right. It's like an all-star, video game, all-star basketball team. Just everybody has went through Renault Pepe, and such amazing work. If you lined up all the creations of Renault and Pepe, you could go endless with just amazing, award winners and just pieces that are just extraordinary.
Exactly. And we were talking off camera. It reminds me a lot of a great restaurant where you have chefs who come up and then go out and obviously create their own.
You want to see a team picture: Greubel, Forsey, Grönefeld, and Strehler together drinking coffee.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and it would. Also, what's sort of interesting about these independent brands is you do get a peek. If you look at their social media pages in online, you do sort of get a peek into who they hang out with. And a lot of times at the shows, I'll see dinners. It'll be Kari, and it'll be the Grönefeld. It'll be people that are
old
similar,
friends.
Old friends that have these really sort of. I guess there's I would imagine a bond there of being those independents, but they're on to something special. And I think that again, this grouping and the list of watches that we have here do sort of define.
So I think if people don't know H.Moser Cie, I mean, they cohabitate the same town as IWC, the other watchmaker in that town. I think they were founded in the early 2000s by another Dr. Lange, not the Dr. Lange who's from A. Lange. And actually the first watch that they designed, and Strehler designed it, was this perpetual movement. And it's a home caliber, I think it's HMC 341, you'll have to quote me on that. And it tries to solve an interesting problem. I mean, most perpetual calendars can be very crowded and very difficult to read, and probably more frustrating, very difficult to set. And so there's an enormous amount of innovation here. So what they have, there's a third hand on the watch, takes advantage of the fact there's 12 hours in a day, and there's 12 months. And so this hand, so it doesn't have a day, but it does that. And then it has an exceptionally large date box, which is a jumping date. So it isn't a slow movement during the course of the day, and at the end of February it goes right to March. And so they call that a flash calendar, and that's a particularly interesting innovation. And on the stem side of it, it's two-step stem. You can set the time independent from the date. And again, the only thing you need a pusher for, and it's on the back of the watch, is for setting the leap year. Everything else can be set forward and backwards. And again, most perpetuals, you only can set it one direction. It's a terrible headache.
It's such a hassle.
Headache to do. 7-day power reserve, which again, that's amazing when you think about it in a watch this size. And even from an aesthetic point of view, so the mechanics are spectacular. And I believe that this particular complication won an SPHG. And I don't think it was this watch, but it was this complication. But the aesthetics are really interesting. I mean, it has a beautiful, it has one of the best designed clasps, I can tell you, for a deploying clasp. It has a beautiful, very artistic case, which kind of flows in a way. And the back of the watch, which you look, is nicely finished. One of the other kind of technical innovations is that it has an escapement that can be replaced. It's a modular escapement. And I think the most interesting about it has a curved sapphire, which itself is probably a pretty large technical achievement.
I can imagine how many they broke just trying to do it. It's just amazing how much technology they put inside this watch, yet how simplistic it looks, and it hits all the nails on the head. And I think, to me, it's, we've talked so much, it's one of your most wearable watches.
Oh, absolutely wearable. It's
so comfy.
That curved, the curved sapphire in the back makes it a very comfortable watch, and it's not a small watch. It's about 41 millimeters, and so it's really a spectacular watch. And again, it's kind of a stealth watch. I mean, you don't, and again, the technology is remarkable.
All right, so next up, a piece that we don't see every day at all, a Grönefeld remontoire with just such a beautiful, probably the most beautiful salmon dial I've ever seen. Like, look at that. Such a gorgeous piece. What made this another target on your list?
Well, going back to, it's interesting that going back to this Renaud and Pape days, the Grönefeld brothers were there together. And the interesting thing for me and how I sort of found this watch is that the remontoire, it's an 8-second remontoire, which is unusual. Yeah. And we'll look at the other side. Most remontoires and most watches are usually a second, and most people use them to drive a deadbeat second. That's probably the most common use of it. This is an 8-second remontoire, and it's actually obviously one of the 2 most common constant force devices. And knowing that history sort of attracted me to them. And then when you actually spend some time with the watch and you look at the level of finishing, and you learn a little bit about the brothers, or 3rd-generation watchmakers. Their father and grandfather were clockmakers.
Yeah, the history is amazing, like a true lineage of watchmakers, restoring clocks all over Europe, and then they end up at Renaud Pape, again, the all-star house, is amazing pieces.
Yeah, and they have a really interesting business model because unlike a lot of independent watchmakers who are purists, where they sort of the Daniel Smith ethic, like every single piece has to be made at home, they kind of outsource the production of the individual components, but they do design and finishing, and they're remarkable. And the finishing on this watch is absolutely remarkable.
It really is.
The next watch here is not from a micro-independent.
No, but it's done in a micro-independent way, I think, right?
Is a Richard Lange tourbillon. As you know, Lange has these 5 families of watches, and Richard Lange is one of them. They're distinguished by having regulator dials. I always find regulator dials interesting because you can't read the time as a glance.
No, you have
it forces you to look at it. So it's an aesthetic that forces you to engage. Interesting enough, historically, like a lot of Lange watches, they're inspired by pocket watches, in this case scientific watches, because I think scientists like regulator dials because seconds are probably more important for them.
Exactly.
There's a series of this has a fusee and chain. In the Lange vocabulary, they're called PLM watches, and it's an extremely difficult constant force device to put together. And they've produced many PLM watches over the course of the year, the 5 versions. They always put in a slightly different watch, and as a set, there's an article in Hodinkee where someone actually showed all 5 of them.
Yeah,
it's absolutely spectacular. But what's really interesting about this watch and what attracted me, it has all the features either you love or you hate about Lange. It's very German, very practical. Is how lively it is. So it has a tourbillon. It's a hacking tourbillon, which I've never seen before.
I don't think there's many out there.
I don't think I can't think of another hacking tourbillon. But Lange watches are usually pretty buttoned up, and they're famous for this 3/4 plate, which is really a way of protecting the watch. But this is a highly windowed or fenestrated or skeletonized watch because it actually exposes more of the movement, and there's no better finished movements out there from a larger producer than Lange.
Hands down there, it's like little CDs. And I think we all decided maybe they were having fun one night and have some nice absinthe. I don't know, something fun.
A couple bottles.
It is very. It's long, but the opposite. It's very, not showing off, but it's showing what can be done. That, the tourbillon, when it's in full view, it's amazing. The back of the case, you can really get in there and see everything where, like, you're right, usually it's very all buttoned up. And
because usually if you look at Lange watches, most of them have the 3/4 plate, except the chronometers where you can actually look inside of them. And usually the only thing you can see is the engraved cock on the back. What's really unusual here is the tourbillon is placed in a way that it's actually you actually can see through the watch and appreciate the depth of the watch and the movement, which, like you said, is these are Lange on absinthe is probably where it is, and it's reminiscent. And I think you brought one of those of the same idea that you see in some modern watchmakers, Greubel Forsey watches, where you try to expose the entire depth of these watches. Yet this is a wearable watch. It's about 42 millimeters. It's only 14 millimeters. You can wear it under a cuff, and yet so much technology. And it's really unusual for a Lange.
very few companies do anything really unique with the tourbillon. It's usually it's on a consistent axis. Yeah, it's in an upright position.
It's a tourbillon.
It's straightforward. It's a tourbillon.
It's Breguet's original invention.
Right, Breguet's original invention, and every brand through the sort of the early 2000s ended up doing it. Brands that probably shouldn't have been doing tourbillons, but were sort of cashing in on.
There's a Breitling tourbillon.
Yeah, there's tourbillons that should probably have never made it to market. But what's fascinating about sort of the independence and what they're able to do, Greubel Forsey, for example, their whole philosophy was we're going to make tourbillons that actually have enhanced performance on a wristwatch. And what I loved about the brand, and I was fortunate enough to sort of be able to speak with Stephen Forsey several years ago and represent the brand and see the collection in person, is that when we look at this particular piece, of course, and where it is exposed, and it is still on some levels fairly basic to what we see today. Even though it's a very complicated watch, what tourbillons sort of represent now is the quality and the ability of a watchmaker of any kind of any brand. What Greubel Forsey did with this particular tourbillon, and I think we'll all at least have an appreciation for it, is that these multi-axis, sometimes driven double tourbillons or quad tourbillons. In their case, they have that. But this is a tourbillon that's pitched at an axis, and it rotates on that axis. So essentially, that as you're wearing it, that in no particular position that the tourbillon's either horizontal or vertical.
Yeah, I believe if you read the literature on this one, is what they did is in a pocket watch it was always kept at one position, right? In your pocket.
That's it.
Exactly. Parallel to the axis of your long axis of your body. I think they studied from an ergonomics point of view what was the average position of their watch.
Yeah.
And I think they've tried to incorporate that.
Beyond just the sort of the technical aspects of the watch and what the brand looks to achieve, the finishing is absolutely sensational. And so I bring the finishing up is because for the first time in the 4 years that I've been here, I've seen now two additional brands with Grönefeld and, of course, Kari Voutilainen. The finishing is on level with, I mean, it's as nice as anything I've ever seen. Of course, Journe does it, Laurent Ferrier. There's nothing on here that isn't finished to really an extraordinary level. And moving from what is sort of a great interpretation of a modern tourbillon is basically the opposite. It's really a traditional tourbillon from F.P. Journe. In this particular piece, if collectors, I'm sure collectors know who watch our show, this is the T30. And this is the tourbillon that was introduced for Mr. Journe's 30th anniversary, and it was limited to 99 pieces. But what's really interesting about this piece is that the tourbillon, of course, is not exposed from the dial side. It is revealed from the 100K spec that closes it up, but it allows, as I like to say, the owner full access to the watch. And tell us a little bit about what you were thinking as you decided to pick this one up, because this is a very interesting watch in sort of the grand scope of what
it's
Journe
kind of
does.
The anti-Journe in some ways. So, like as you can see, I'm really interested in history and how watches relate back to, let's say, if you say the watch is a mature technology, probably sometime in the mid-17th, mid-18th century, we would recognize those watches. Most of the problems, Breguet and all those guys define most of it. And so, I mean, the history here is always captive, is that this is the first watch that apparently, and he's told this story many times, the first watch that Journe made was a pocket watch with a tourbillon at a time when tourbillons were difficult to make. And on his 30th anniversary, he wanted to do an homage to that, and he did this watch, which in some ways captures that, because you show the back of the watch. If you look at the architecture of the movement, it's an old pocket watch type movement. It's in brass, so it's the old materials. He could, if you look at the watch case, it's two-tone. It's gold and silver, which is really a spectacular kind of material. And like a lot of old pocket watches, and because it has a 100 case back, it forces you to interact with the watch like a pocket watch. So it's both a wristwatch. When you take it off and you show it to somebody, it feels like a pocket watch. So I think it's really interesting. And it has probably the largest blued screws that I've ever seen. And again, that's very similar to what you see in that. And I always love the Journes with the brass movements. I mean, those older Journes are really spectacular. And that leads us to this watch. So Urban Jurgensen is a very, very famous watch brand. I'm not sure people know this brand. it goes back to the late 18th century, I think. Urban Jurgens himself, his father founded it, and he's one of these child prodigies at a time when I guess watchmakers were almost like scientists, and he went off to Switzerland and studied with a very famous Swiss watchmaker named Curate, actually married his daughter, but also did some time in internships, I guess in modern parlance, with Breguet and Arnold, and started a long family lineage, that, and they were the official watchmakers for the Danish court and things like that. And there's a lot of innovations tied to them, and they were this Danish-Swiss company. The family line ran out in the early 20th century, and the kind of company got broken up into pieces. And there was a very famous watchmaker, entrepreneur in his own right, named Peter Baumberger in the late 1970s, early 80s. I think he was president of UGS USA, but don't quote me on that. And he kind of brought the brand together. And he was a very innovative watchmaker. He brought another very innovative watchmaker with him, Derek Pratt. And together they made these beautiful watches. If you ever go to the auction, there are these UGS watches from the 80s, 90s. They're absolutely beautiful, both pocket watches and wrist watches. But one of the things he wanted to do was to figure out how to get back to a Daytona escapement. So they did this research project internally, and it started with him and with Pratt, and they recruited another very well-known watchmaker, Jean-Francois Mourjon, and together they got a prototype for that. Now, around the time that the UGS was sold, Baumgarten actually died, and actually Pratt died. And the other person they were collaborating with, going back to this idea of a small community, was Kari Voutilainen. And so Kari worked with the UGS and did the manufacturing of the components and the eventual regulation of the watch, and they actually came up with the first détente, pivoted détente escapement that I know of in a wristwatch. So it's an amazing technical achievement on top of this being an absolutely beautiful watch. So in current independent watchmakers, there's actually three of them, three different elaborations on a double impulse natural escapement. Probably the best known are the Laurent Ferriers, and in this particular watch is the Ferrier Traveler, which is a GMT watch. This is a special edition. This is the Hodinkee edition that I purchased before the auction, and it is an absolutely spectacular watch in its own right. I think we have one of the original Traveler watches, but in this,
we actually do.
Pull those.
So the original Traveler watch, they're very nice travel watches. They have these nice pushers that make it easy to adjust the hands on the watch. And the original watches have a sub-second dial. In the enameled version, and both of these are enameled versions, they got rid of the sub-second dial. And in the original Ferrier versions, there are two boxes. One corresponds to a 24-hour clock, so you usually set as your reference time. So if you live in the East Coast of the U.S. and you go to Europe, you know that's how you work it. And the other was a date. On a personal basis, I always found those things asymmetric and not appealing. And so when this special edition came out, I always thought it was really
so clean.
Was really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful blue enameled with a brushed blue dial around the enamel. And what was also interesting is a nice and interesting choice was the use of titanium. So I think another theme that you're seeing more and more with independents and other high-end watches is making watches that are not out of precious metals. So this is a titanium watch. We looked at a steel watch earlier in the Grönefeld, and this, of course, up there with Lange and Journe. These are spectacular movements.
Oh yeah, finishing. I'm a big fanboy for Laurent Ferrier. I really do think they're just Patek in 200 years. Just the design ethics of it just looks very modern, very, very refined, and finishing is just outstanding. Just really, really beautifully well done movements. And I think in this Hodinkee Traveler, such a clean dial. You got the enamel for the nice pop. You got the brushed blue around it, and it does everything you need it to do, but it stays quiet in the room, if that makes sense.
It does.
It's extremely, extremely light. It's one of the most wearable watches, and it has his version of a natural escapement. And it's probably too much detail to go in here, but if you are interested in that kind of technology, it's definitely worth talking to. The other natural escapement, as long as we have it here on the desk, is this is probably the last watch that I'm aware of that Journe himself was really 100% committed to designing, and it was the Chronometra Optimum, which has his take on a natural escapement.
And the version that we have here is the boutique edition, the Black Label Platinum version. And to me, this watch is representative and sort of encompasses everything that FP Journe stands for. The technology, sort of the execution of near perfection in terms of how the watches are finished, his thought process behind the design, and one of the cool, it's not a trick necessarily, but one of the things that you will realize is if you flip the watch over, there is a backwards facing second hand that is tied to the constant force. So it is a deadbeat second hand on the back, and it goes backwards. And the people that have bought the watch, if you don't, it's almost like you show them. It's like an Easter egg. You show it to them, and they go, "Oh, that's great! Look at that! It's going backwards, and it's a deadbeat." And for the brand, I think this is really, to this day, this is the highlight of his current collection. Again, focuses on optimizing exactly what he was attempting to optimizing. Sort of.
It also, interestingly enough, has a remontoire. So
right.
He uses his natural escapements attached to a remontoire. From a technical point of view, and this is probably, I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to understand how these watchmakers work. This is one of the most challenging watches to actually go into the mechanics of and how they actually made it work. And from a telling time point of view, it's probably, and they're extremely accurate. I can tell you that this watch and the Ferrier are extremely accurate.
Right. I mean, I guess nicely sort of segues into sort of what I'm most excited about.
Oh yes, this is the.
These are the, in my opinion, the
This is worth it all.
the cherries of the collection. Geoff, tell us a little bit about what we have going on these last two pieces.
These are two Voutilainen watches. Kari Voutilainen, is a Finnish watchmaker who operates out of Switzerland and makes his own watches. He makes, I think, 50 watches a year. Mm-hmm. And these are some of the most spectacular watches in every phase of watch design, from aesthetics to wearability to mechanics and what he's best known for is his dial. He's a very innovative watchmaker. As I mentioned before, he was involved with the Teuton escapement in terms of the ultimate production of that. And with Voutilainen watches, everyone looks at the dials, but you should really turn them over and look at the back. This is a natural escapement also, so this is the third of the natural escapements. You have these very interesting double escapement wheels you can see, which are next to each other, which is a unique proprietary aspect of their watch. Yeah. I think the Voutilainen watches have probably the largest balance wheel and balance cock.
It's the largest balance wheel I've
think it's 13.6 millimeters or something like that.
With the exception of like a Frank Mueller.
Or that big tourbillon that came out like last year, that crazy one. I think what's important to note for the viewers and why me and John are so exciting, we see probably, I dare say, the most watches out of any company pre-owned. Whether it be just on a repair or buying or being offered watches. This is the first time I've had carry these pieces in. I can actually look at it in person. John has been, he has been with so many independent. He started in an independent boutique, and it's just these are watches that you don't see. You
just don't see them.
It's just a real pleasure to be, actually have these in the flesh, and have two of them to really enjoy. That's why we're kind of a little giddy up here.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, because it's a very big balance wheel, and it beats relatively slowly.
Yes. I
think it's 18,000 change per hour, and so it's very dramatic because you look at the balance ring. And there's a lot of novelty here. Not only is there a natural his take on a natural escapement, but also the balance springs are unique. They have a Phillips overcoil and a Grossman inner curve, so they're really interestingly designed watches. And the finishing, you could just look at it forever. I mean, it's probably the most remarkable finishing. When you turn the watch over, it's a beautiful, very, very aesthetically pleasing dial with, and all the components are fantastic. It's a caliber 28, so the Vink date's French for 28. And what's interesting to me is this is the ISO version. So the Vink date was the watch that was the first watch with his own movement. Kari had initially designed cases and finished them and used other movements that he optimized, but this is the first time he built a movement himself. The ISO has an unusual way of telling time, and what happens is that every hour the hour hand moves around 12 times, and the minute hand moves around 13. And so what it means at the top of every hour the hands are together, and at the bottom of every hour is 180 degrees. And on around the outside of the dial, the radius of the dial, the circumference of the dial, what you can see is the minutes. So you can actually use that. It's like a regulator watch, so it's easy for you to read it off. And again, very similar to the regulator watches, it forces attention.
It does.
And you have to look at it. So you're not going to glance at this. After some time, you kind of learn how to do it, but and I think so it creates a very different experience with the watch. And it's worth it for a Voutilainen watch because the engraving. So we showed a watch earlier, the Journe T30, where you saw the similar type of engraving on the case. But the engraving of the Voutilainen watches are absolutely mind-blowing. And in this case, there's 3 different levels of the engraving that go along with the depth of the watch. So it's absolutely spectacular watch. The hands are beautiful, they're polished, and it's really amazing. So the last watch here is another Voutilainen watch, and this is kind of a lucky purchase by myself. So after the Vinct 8, the next watch that Voutilainen came out was called the 217 QRS, and the watch had a redesigned case and had a very interesting retrograde calendar, and it's a very pretty and nice retrograde calendar that's fully embedded into the dial, unlike a lot of retrograde calendars, and has a very interesting motion. At the end of the month, it smoothly and very slowly comes back to the first, so it's quite spectacular. This was a special edition that was a collaboration effectively between Manfredi Jewelers, who's one of the distributors of Voutilainen in the US, to honor their 30th anniversary, and they made 8 watches. And what they did is they put the 217 QRS movement into a Vinct 8 case. And I like the Vinct 8 case a little better than the lugs. I like the lugs in this case better than the other one.
Nice.
And what's also nice about this, it's in steel. So it's, again, going back to this idea that maybe non-precious metals, and it's a spectacular steel. It's very light. I mean, it has very similar movement. You couldn't tell these two movements apart. At least I couldn't from here. But this is done, you can see, in rose gold. So it's a very pretty movement, and has...
It's a beautiful tone to it, and
it really, actually, the tone is really pretty. It's almost, it's sort of heavy on the copper.
Yeah, maybe like a 5N compared to a 3N rose gold.
It's I wouldn't say it's, maybe it's a little bit rosier than even like a Journe movement, but I mean, it's spectacular. The entire, like, just looking at it from this perspective. I mean, it is really something. And if you have that sort of appreciation for it, if you're a viewer or a collector that, you know, is sort of on the fence about maybe the independence, I mean, just sitting here looking at this, I can't stop smiling, so I'm going to put it back down so I can go through and discuss this a little bit more. But man, that is spectacular.
I think a lot of collectors, unfortunately, don't get a chance to really touch a lot of these watches. So I think there are a lot of collectors out there who, you know, have the capability to maybe jump into the independent world, and, you know, I definitely invite them, you know, if there's ever like a watch show near you or an independent watch
100%.
fair, go out. You know, it's worth a trip. First of all, you probably meet some really friends who have some like-minded thinking and have some fun that way. But when you see these pieces in person, it really all makes sense. No matter how much you read and you get all the history down, when you see these dials and these movements in person and just how they look as a watch, as a complete product, it's stunning, you know? And I think sometimes that you might have to drive a little bit, but it's worth the drive to see some of these pieces before you pull the trigger, because it shows you really why it's worth the money. This is real craftsmanship. This is real watchmaker who's really putting his head together with his team and really trying to get his vision out there. He's not just trying to make a product to sell, but he's really just making a piece of art that he hopes people can appreciate. And if money's involved, that's what it is. But I think you really gotta, you know, try as much as you can to get your hands on pieces, or just in front of pieces like these, because it's just amazing. When you really see it, that's when it all kind of...
You can tell when somebody's really sort of in love with their watch. They look at it and a little smirk comes, and they're focused in on the idea that, you know, watches are here to tell time, but there's that connection that you should have with the watches that you're...
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I wear my watches, so I don't put anything in a vault. Perhaps I should, but I don't.
People who appreciate the independent scene recognize that the amount of hand finishing and handwork, and if you understand the brands and what they're attempting to achieve, to me, beyond the technology, it's the finishing that I find the most, I guess, sensational. In that, when I look at the finishing, I get that there's an excitement to it.
I think it's the attention to detail, because the selection they make even on the straps, their buckles, the wearability of the watch, and like we pointed out here, is that while it's very easy to get amazed by the technology, the case designs, along with the finishing, are spectacular.
Incredible. And the other, and this is true about these independents, like they can't really afford to make a mistake.
No.
If they make a watch that just is a bomb, that's a problem.
A lot of man hours.
But I would argue it's sort of like a difference between a small company and a big company. They can afford to make a mistake in the sense that they'll go away. If you're Lange or if you're Omega, it's hard, you're driven to more conservative because you're going to drive 5, 6, 10,000 watches into the space. So I think because there are a sea of independent watchmakers. So in some ways, if they make a mistake, it's existential for them. But in some way, it really helps the entire industry, because I think, again, we talk about a lot of ideas that are embedded in these watches, a lot of business models. As you said, they're contagions, they're viral. The larger ones are taking over.
I think on a finishing note, if somebody's watching this right now and you've never really maybe seen a video of somebody finishing a watch movement, go out on YouTube and search, because I think that's the thing a lot of people don't understand. Like, we say finishing and it's beautiful, but when you think about somebody like literally having like a toothpick and having a part on a toothpick and then slowly swiping on some abrasive and then checking this toothpick and then this part, and it's really the work that goes involved, and somebody's whole day might be polishing this little thing that you may never ever see, but that's his job, and his job is to make sure that it's perfect.
And what's really interesting, if you go to the Lange factory and you bring your watch with them, the finishing on the balance cocks are such that someone put on a microscope and say, "Oh, Mary Beth did that."
Oh wow, that's incredible.
They can recognize who did it.
And that's what we say when we say craftsmanship, and the true evolution is not just that, it's beautiful. It's like, you think about the man hours, the people hours that go into these watches and making these watches stand out. It really is so much. Definitely, you got to get out there and do some research. And I think when people actually see what's going on, and you watch a watchmaker work for a little while, you see like, this isn't that easy. It's like, it seems like I think all the watch brands, when you go to them, they're like, "Oh, you want to finish a plate?" And you're there, and you're like, you can never make one perfect. And you're like, and somebody's just like, like a little teenager's just doing it with finesse, and you can't do it. And that's the dedication. And just like a fine painter or a fine craftsman, it just takes a lot of man hours. It 100%. Takes tradition being passed down from one person to another. And I think, to wrap it all up, that's what we have at this table. The tradition of horology, the grouping, the teamwork that's involved to make excellent products, to make excellent timepieces, and just looking this row alone, this is just pure creative energy funneled through watchmaking in such an amazing way. And it's weird, but all of these brands have something to do with each other. And so many watchmakers that are intermingled, and just to see this all in one amazing lineup, it's sweet. Thank you for coming, Geoff. This has been fantastic. It's definitely been a highlight.
It has been a highlight.
This is great.